This is one that you might not have heard before. This is a story called Sackcloth, 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 Sackcloth. It's another Palestinian fairy tale from the collection Speak Bird, Speak Again. Sackcloth falls under the ATU tale type 510B, otherwise known as the unnatural love, the dress of gold, of silver, of stars. Yes, the dress of gold, dress of gold, silver, of stars. Or all kinds of fur, all kinds of fur. Most famous fairy tales of this type include Charles Perrault's Donkey Skin, Donkey Skin, Donkey Skin, and the Brothers Grimm's Alelrau, 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 or all kinds of fur. And just as a heads up, this is one of the kind of weird tale types of fairy tales. The common setup of these tales is that a princess must run away from her father who wants to marry her, and she must disguise herself using either some sort of magical gown or a special cloak or garment made out of animal fur or skin, such as donkey skin. Some of these stories, like Sackcloth and Cat Skin, also have similarities to Cinderella, and they include 3 balls thrown over 3 nights, in which our protagonist finds her true love. Like I did with the other story from this collection, I have rewritten it in my own words and in my own voice, but I tried to stay true and close to how it was recorded in Speak Bird, Speak Again. I have also done my best to find pronunciations for names and words that I'm less familiar with, and I hope that I do okay with those, and hopefully I found the correct pronunciations, and whenever I couldn't find any, I tried to get as close as possible. So, this is my little book of fairy tales. I'd like to keep adding my own little versions of stories in here. The last time I made a video with this, the cover was just plain, but this time, when I was adding in sackcloth, I decided to zhuzh up the cover a little bit before I begin. I know that many people probably don't know what a sackcloth is, was most of the information that I could find about them, but this story obviously features a sackcloth. So this is my little book of fairy tales. I wrote out fairy tales and covered the words in gold glitter, and I put a stamp of a little deer down here. Then I added some gold trim and some little gems to make it feel extra fancy. Okay, let's flip through and find sackcloth in here. This is the story I did in my last fairy tale video, in Spinyazer, Chief of the Birds. Here we have sackcloth. You can see here's the first page. I'll hold it here so you can follow along with me if you would like. Sackcloth. Once upon a time, there was a king who had a beautiful wife and a beautiful little daughter. For many years, they were very happy and their kingdom was filled with love. But one tragic day, his wife laid her head down and did not pick it up again. The king began the search for a new wife to replace the queen, but his grief had driven him quite mad. He declared that he would wed only she who could match his late wife's beauty. His advisors paraded a long line of beautiful women through the palace for him to peruse, but none pleased him. Not one of them was as beautiful as she had been. And then, one day, he began to notice the likeness held within his own daughter. He called to his advisors and told them that he would accept none but her. "Father," she began when they brought her to him. "No," he said, "do not call me father. From now on, call me cousin." "But father, a worthy man, I'm your daughter," she cried. "I am your king," he told her, "and I've made up my mind that you will be my queen." He sent for the magistrate, or the Qadi, and asked him, "A tree that I have cared for, feeding and watering it, is it legally mine, or can someone else claim it?" "No one else can claim it," replied the Qadi. "It is rightfully yours." As soon as the Qadi left, the father called for a wedding dress to be brought for his daughter, with jewelry to match. He was determined that they should be wedded the next day. When the girl saw these preparations and knew that her father would not hear reason, she began to plan. She snuck away from the palace and found a local sackcloth maker. Sackcloth is a rough, bridal gown and jewelry. Once she was the perfect image of a bride, her father came to fetch her for the ceremony that would bind them as husband and wife. "Father," she began, but he cut her off with a shout. "Do not call me father," he bellowed. "I have told you to call me cousin." "All right, cousin," she conceded. "Please grant me just a moment to use the facilities before the ceremony." "No," he frowned. "If I let you go now, you might try to run away." "Oh, but I won't," she assured him. "If you're worried about that, then let me ease your worries. Why don't you tie a rope to my wrist, and any time you start to worry, just tug on your end of it, and you'll discover that I'm still there." With a bit of theatrics on her part, he finally agreed, and the rope was procured. She slipped easily from the house and undid the knot at her wrist, retying it around a heavy stone along with her bracelets. Then she went back to the shed, donned the sackcloth, and, invoicing the help of Allah, ventured into the fast-approaching night with her wedding gown rolled tight in her pack. Meanwhile, her father tugged and tugged at the rope, hearing the light clinking and tinkling of the bracelets every time. However, as more and more time passed, he grew suspicious, and not even the sound of the bracelets could reassure him. He followed the line of the rope until he found the end, tied to the stone with the bracelets dangling from it. He turned red with anger at the deception, threw on a cloak, and mounted a horse to search for the girl himself. By this time she was well outside of the city. The night was very dark. When eventually she saw him approaching, she clung to the trunk of a tree, peering out from the shadows. Her father slowed his horse when he saw her, but, disguised as she was by the sackcloth, he did not recognize her. "You there," he called out. "Have you seen a girl with such and such features pass this way?" She cleared her throat and deepened her voice. "No, sir," she said, shaking her head. "I've seen no such thing. I can hardly see my own hands in front of me." He waved her off and spurred his horse forward once more. She watched as his figure retreated, and took note of the path he took, taking the other herself. For days and days she walked, sleeping here and waking there, till at last she came upon a city. She was very hungry by this time, and so she took shelter by the wall of a palace, hoping to find some scraps to eat. Luck was on her side, and soon a servant girl opened the kitchen door to dump a large platter of leftover food. Sackcloth fell upon the scraps and set to eating. When the girl saw her, she startled and rushed back to her mistress. "Oh, mistress," she called out, "there's a strange sight outside, an ugly old man in sackcloth gobbling up the table scraps." "Go call him in," commanded the mistress. "I'd like to see him." The girl went and fetched Sackcloth, who followed her willingly, as she had nowhere else to go. "What's the situation with you, uncle?" the mistress asked. "Are you human or jinn?" "I'm human, and the choicest of the race," Sackcloth told them in her put-upon voice. "But Allah has created me the way I am, so I must cover myself as I do. Please, if you'd let me stay, I'd earn my keep." "What skill do you have?" the woman asked. "What could you do if I were to hire you?" "Oh, I don't have any skills in particular," she answered. "I can stay in the kitchen peeling onions and passing things over when needed. I'm sure an extra pair of strong hands is never unwelcome." So they put her to work in the kitchen, and soon everyone was saying, "Here comes Sackcloth, there goes Sackcloth." They grew fond of her kindness and her eagerness to offer help, and they were happy to have their Sackcloth around. She stayed in the kitchen under the protection of the cook, and not one person suspected that their funny old man was really a beautiful princess. One day there was a wedding in the city, and all the king's household was invited. That evening the servants were led off work early to prepare for the spectacle. "Hey, Sackcloth," they called out, "won't you come with us and have a look at the wedding? It's sure to be grand." "Oh no, Allah help me," she exclaimed. "I can't go look at weddings or anything else like that. A place of such merriment and excitement is no place for an old man like me. You go and enjoy it for me, won't you?" They were all reluctant to leave their friend behind, but eventually they relented. The house emptied of all but Sackcloth. she was truly alone, and then removed her sackcloth. She bathed and dressed herself in the wedding dress she had brought with her. When she reached the home where the celebration was taking place, she was overwhelmed by the sound of joyful music, the smells of all kinds of warm, decadent foods. She found herself on the women's side of the room, where she was quickly folded into a line of women, dancing the dabka. She let herself be pulled along and stomped her feet with the others, letting the music overtake her body. She laughed joyously at the feeling of fresh air on her cheeks and the warmth of the dancers around her as she stomped and kicked across the room. She danced and danced until she'd had her fill of dancing. The other women begged her to stay and dance with them more, but she declined and left before any of them learned who she was or where she'd come from. Returning home, she donned her sackcloth again and curled up beside the fire to sleep. When the other servants got back from the celebration, they gathered around her and started badgering her. "How can you stay home and sleep on a night like this?" they taunted. "May you never rise. If only you'd come along with us to the wedding, you'd have seen the girl who danced and danced and left without anyone knowing her name." "Ah," she smiled wryly, "I can see it all just as well in my dreams." The next night went just the same, with Sackcloth refusing her friend's cajoling, and the mysterious, beautiful girl appearing to dance the night away before disappearing into the night. But the servants were not the only ones captivated by her. When the queen returned home that night, she sat beside her son and told him what she'd seen on her side of the celebration. "I wish you could have seen her," she mused. "She seemed to glow as she danced, such that the lanterns around us dimmed in comparison. I just know she'd be your perfect match, but I cannot catch her while she dances, and I cannot catch her when she leaves." The prince thought on this for a moment. "Tomorrow night, let me dress in women's clothes for the party," he suggested. "Take me with you to the women's side. If anyone should ask, say to them, 'This is my sister's daughter. She's here visiting us, and I brought her with me to see the celebrations.'" She agreed, and the next night she dressed her son up as her niece and took him with her. Sackcloth, meanwhile, waited again until she was alone, and then donned her lovely gown. As soon as she arrived at the wedding, she was handed the handkerchief to lead the dance, the other women agreeing that she was the best dancer of any of them. They all clasped hands and followed her lead as she kicked her feet and whirled through the crowd. Hidden among the women, the prince watched, transfixed by her beauty and the jubilation in her every movement. When she decided she had had her fill of dancing, she handed the kerchief off to another woman and slipped away, but this time she was followed by a silent shadow in a borrowed dress. The prince watched from a safe distance as she approached his own home and slipped through the kitchen door. Through the window, he saw her step into a cupboard and emerge covered by the sackcloth before reclining by the fire. "What?" he said to himself. "She dwells in my own home all of this time, hiding herself away with a sackcloth." He heard voices in the distance as partygoers began to make their ways back home, and so he returned to his room to remove his own disguise. The next morning he came to the kitchen and said to the kitchen mistress, "I don't want the usual servants to bring my food today. I want Sackcloth here to serve my dinner, and I want him to share it with me." "Oh, master, for the sake of Allah," she protested, looking between him and her mistress. "I can't do it. Why would you want to have dinner with an old man like me? I doubt I could even reach your chambers with my knees." "You must bring my dinner so we can eat together," he replied. "I won't eat it if it's served by anyone else." And so the servants prepared his dinner and arranged it onto a platter and gave it to Sackcloth. She carried it, pretending to limp until she was halfway up the stairs. Then she made as if her foot had slipped and dropped the whole platter. "Please, master," she pleaded. "Didn't I tell you I can't carry anything?" "Try again," the prince insisted. With the second platter, she came up to the landing at the top of the stairs, slipped, and dropped it. "Go and get another," said the son of the king. "I'll wait as long as it takes to have your company." With the third platter, she limped and limped, leaning here and there until she reached the top and served him his dinner. "Come sit here with me," said the prince, closing the door. "Let's share this meal together." "Please, master," she protested. "I really ought to get back to work. I cannot leave the others to do my share without me." "Nonsense," the prince said. "Now please do sit down. I would like to have dinner with you." Tentatively, she sat beside him, but made no move to eat. "Won't you eat with me?" he asked. "A meal as delicious as this is made to be shared." She reached to take a piece of bread and scooped up a bit of meat with it. As she brought it towards her mouth, his hand stopped hers with a light touch. "It must be difficult to eat with your face covered as it is," he mused. "Why don't you remove it and eat comfortably?" "Oh, I mustn't," she protested. "You will have no appetite to eat yourself if you're sitting across from my ugly old face." "Please," he said, his hand warm through the rough cloth. "I don't mind, truly." With his free hand he offered her his knife. Through the hole in her sackcloth she looked into his eyes and saw only kindness. She took the knife from him and carefully sliced through the cloth covering her face. "There you are," he grinned as she was revealed to him. "We have been searching, wondering who the wonderful girl was who came to the wedding, and all this time you've been living under my own roof." He called for his mother and told her he had found his bride. For 40 days the public crier announced, "No one is to eat or drink except at the house of the king." They held wedding celebrations and gave her to him as a wife. This is my tale, I've told it, and in your hands I leave it. So that was the story of Sackcloth. I know that it isn't really, but I felt like it was kind of a fun one to pick during Pride Month. I feel like it has a little bit of that Shakespearean kind of gender bending vibes. I think it's kind of fun that the princess disguises herself as an old man, and that the prince disguises himself